So as we turn our attention to the Reformation, one of the things that we need to know at the outset is that the church in the West kind of found its identity through allegiance to the Pope and a kind of spirituality that was distinctive to Western Christianity, made it different from Eastern Christianity. However, that did not mean that there were not profound and ongoing disagreements about what the substance of Christianity is or what authentic Christianity might look like. And those were exacerbated beginning in the 14th century as the Bible began to be translated into the vernacular, into the languages of the various countries in Europe. And so one of the things that happened as the Bible was translated into the vernacular is people started to read the Bible and to realize that there were aspects of Western Christianity and its spirituality that were not authentically biblical. And so those basically had two different trajectories or frameworks. One was a kind of moral disagreement with things that were happening in the church, and the other is the kind of theological disagreement or doctrinal disagreement with what was happening in the Western church more generally. The moral parts actually didn't require the Bible to know that they were wrong. I mean, there was a widespread practice of clerical concubinage, which is, ostensibly all of the clergy in the West would have been celibate, but most of them, was a kind of a nudge, wink situation where a lot of them were visiting brothels or had clandestine wives, that sort of thing. There was also the widespread practice of what was called at the time simony or pluralism, which meant that you would be a priest in one church and have another church that you were also ostensibly priest from, and you get income from both parishes, even though you might not ever visit one or the other. Tons and tons of bishops would have multiple sees that they would be overseeing, but they would never visit one of those sees, for instance. So there were a lot of problems of that sort. Also, during the later part of the medieval period, beginning in the 14th century, there was a succession of truly embarrassing popes that were just basically immoral. Either they were immoral because of sexual profligacy, or they were immoral because they saw themselves as temporal rulers and conquerors rather than spiritual leaders of the flock. And so, in particular, a couple of notorious popes in the later 15th century, especially Julius II, put themselves in that role. And he raised an army and conquered lots of territory and so forth. So these were scandals. There was also a problem where there was a kind of back and forth about authority between various kings and princes and the Pope about who was going to be able to elect bishops. And one of these kings actually deposed a pope. So that there was, and then set up another pope in his place, so that there was this controversy called the Great Schism, which resulted in, at one point, 3 different popes at one time. So this was a scandal. The division of Christendom was a scandal for a lot of different people, both lay people and theologians and priests alike. So what the Reformation was elicited by, some of these moral problems. But as the theologians also began to read the text of Scripture, they realized that there were aspects of the faith that had been obscured by various forms of Western spirituality. One of the key aspects of this was the authority of the Scripture itself. Along the way, both Scripture and tradition had been set up as equal authorities that would give sort of light to what the Christian faith or authentic Christian faith looked like. And the Reformers said, no, we want to assert the central and prime authority of the Scriptures. The Scriptures always retain the authority to reform the tradition. Wherever the tradition departs from the clear authority of Scripture, then the Scripture retains the authority to revise and reform that tradition. And so that the authority of Scripture was a kind of clarion call of the Reformation. Alongside of that was the priority in Scripture of justification by faith alone and not by works. This, of course, begins with the controversies that are stirred up by Martin Luther and his posting of the 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. But it also continues throughout all the places where the Reformation gains influence. Now, in the Church of England, there is a kind of unlikely leader in the Reformation in Henry VIII. Henry VIII doesn't actually care about these priorities of the Reformation. He has his own political interests that he wants to advance. And of course, key among them is the ability to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon. But Henry actually elects as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who is himself very interested in the various doctrinal and moral reforms that come about through the Reformation. And Cranmer also has a profound knack for diplomacy. So he's able to advance these reforms while keeping his head, which is not an easy thing to do under Henry VIII. Lots of people end up dying under Henry VIII, both Catholic and Protestant. Now, the Reformation in England, as it takes shape, has a peculiar form relative to the other Reformation churches in England. Its goal is to retain all that is laudable and good and noble in the history of the church, while reforming the church to be more in accord with Scripture. So one of the things that you'll find as you come into the Anglican tradition is we have a liturgy, and the liturgy draws from the various liturgies that have characterized all of Christendom, both East and West. We have the apostolic order of bishops, priests, and deacons, which we share with Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy. We have an emphasis on the history of the church as being relevant and important for the interpretation of Scripture. In our articles of religion, which I'll talk about in one of the next videos, that we talk about the church being governed by Scripture, but also taking its cues in the interpretation of Scripture from the creeds that developed in the history of Christianity, and also from the teaching tradition, the consensual teaching tradition that comes from the first 5 centuries of the church. So as we are both a church that is both Reformed and Catholic, we've never taken as the core of our identity that we are Protestants. Now, of course, we protest against anything that doesn't conform itself to Scripture. But in our identity, we consider ourselves to be Reformed Catholic, or another word that we use is Evangelical Catholic. There's a 19th century Anglican bishop of New York named John Henry Hobart, and his episcopal motto was Evangelical Faith and Apostolic Order. And in general, that stands as a nice way of summarizing how we understand ourselves in the Anglican tradition.